Good morning. Sorry I'm a little late.
Good morning.
How is everyone?
Doing well, thank you.
Good.
Doing well, yes, thank you.
Today is the birthday of Georg Ivanovich Gurdjieff, a crazy Armenian who developed a number of interesting things. He wrote some music with Thomas de Hartmann, who was classically trained in the Russian um, royal music circuit. He developed a number of what are called sacred dances and wrote a number of books, including Beelzebub's Tales to his grandchildren. Very interesting fellow. Let's see. Today we have a meeting with Nobuko Yoshida, who has done a lot of quite amazing work in the mobile process calculator and concurrency theory fields. She is going to work with us to get the combinators paper published. So we're looking at a particular venue to publish in within the next, or to submit to within the next few days. So looking forward to that. Should be an interesting discussion. I don't know if anyone here watches the Pi for You repo on Arching GitHub. The ladle proof theory rules are now completely spelled out for both the intuitionistic case, which has been for a while, and the classical case. So I had to introduce rules to cover the polarity between the different contexts in the classical case. So it matches the linear notions of bang and why not, of course, and why not. So that's now in the repository, and people can take a look at that. So now we're largely working on the examples, one of which will be the combinators that we'll be submitting as a separate publication, I mentioned earlier. The reason that's useful is because with the combinators, we don't have to deal with nominal phenomena. So we can show the logic from in application to a computationally complete system that handles mobility and concurrency, but without the complicating details of nominal phenomena. So that's already being spelled out in the paper. More is in the commented out in the LaTeX, then in the then it's actually showing. But you can read the source if you want to. Any questions or comments about that? Okay, all right. I'm looking forward to seeing the results with respect to Casper. I'm looking forward to seeing the results of limiting the distance of the last finalized block from the tip, so that that should Sorry, my dog just knocked my headphones out of my ears. Yeah, so that should result in a a constant time on the proposal times, even when you have equal distribution on the stakes. So, hoping to find out the results of those tests today at Dev Standup. Any other questions or comments?
In this repository, yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
In Pi4U repository, is there Agda code or?
The Agda code is not there. I've been so one of the things that as I've been working with this is recognizing that in order to get the type system of the native language to do the work that I want it to do, I need some computational reflection. So, and Agda doesn't have that. So I'm debating as to whether or not that's enough reason to jump back to Scala or not. So it's just
you mentioned Kiyama, so can you just very shortly say for what do you need Kiyama?
so the input format is a rewrite system. So Kiyama allows you to describe a rewrite system. So it has data structures that support a rewrite system.
Okay.
Greg,
So, yeah.
in your discussion about the phonoplane, projective geometry is a big area. And does the phonoplane have special consideration for us? Do you see it as distinguished in some interesting way, especially for Archain or Rolang?
No, the only reason to so the phonoplane choice is just to show give the smallest possible example of a general algorithm. So the algorithm is you hand me a finite geometry, and the geometry is a finite geometry is going to be specified in terms of some points and some lines and some instance relations. And then I hand you back a process expression which fully and faithfully models that geometry in such a way that the lines, that the overall process, the overall geometry will be a process. The lines will be components of that process that are put in par. And the points will be sets of redexes. And so now to illustrate how this algorithm works, let's pick the smallest possible example, and the phonoplane is the smallest possible example. There are an infinite number of inputs that you can hand to the algorithm, but the phonoplane encoding shows it illustrates how to do this in general. So that's why I picked it. It was just because it's the first projective geometry.
Thank you. That's sort of what I was hoping to hear. Could you say some more? You talked about evolving geometries. Could you say some more about that?
Yeah, so in general, if you read Euclid's Elements, Euclid is not imagining that space itself changes, nor is Riemann imagining that space itself changes. Right? So for centuries, people think of space itself as a static thing. Newton thinks of space as a very static thing. It's the framework in which all things exist and are located. It's not until Einstein that we began to think of space itself as having dynamics, as wiggling and moving and undulating. And it takes a lot of work on the part of two of our, greatest geniuses, David Hilbert and Albert Einstein, to come up with a framework in which they can express the fabric of space, the geometry of space evolving. And it's really, it's quite a hefty apparatus to talk about the evolution of space, meaning that the kind of geometric information about locations of things relative to each other changes over time. But when you do this encoding, where you take, some specification of points and lines, and you turn it into a process expression, especially this particular kind of process expression where the points are sets of red X's, then the potential or possibility of the evolution of that geometry is right in your face. Because if the process expression doesn't, on reduction, the process expression doesn't recurse back to its original form, then you're going to get something different than your original geometry. So in the case of the phonoplane encoding, for example, if you have L1 and L3 interact, then you are now, you've destroyed that red X, which means you've gotten rid of the whole corner of the triangle, the lower left corner, the red point, potentially disappears. So unless you put that point back as a result of the interaction, you've moved on to a different geometry. And the nice thing is that you can see that immediately in the expression that represents the geometry. The possibility of the geometry changing in time is right in your face. There's no way around it. And moreover, it's quite simple. And something that I didn't talk about in the RCast is that it's not a notion of wall clock time. It's a notion of time that emerges as a result of some deeper dynamics. Right? So things interact with each other, and as a result of their interaction, we can think about a notion of time that is related to this interaction. Basically, it's the evolution of the rule for interaction that gives rise to a notion of time. Now that is directly related to the architecture of RChain and Casper. In particular, we have endeavored to make all of the constraints which might normally be expressed in terms of the wall clock, expressed in terms of the evolution of the DAG. As the DAG evolves, which is only related to the evolution of the COM rule, then we can count, essentially the block height or things that are related to the DAG structure. And
so if time space is constructible, and if it has been constructed, that can have a conditional structure in terms of how it's generated?
Well, what we're saying is that there's something different than wall clock time. In
I mean, I
many
think
ways,
of simple space-time generation as events, creating time-space intervals, and
yeah.
absorbing events as
So
space-time intervals. As you know,
so the notion of event here is the common event.
constructing space-time.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
But
Jim, can you
how
hear
we
me?
look at the geometry that is thus constructed is we get to choose what geometries have meaning or we can listen for or interact with.
Jim, can you hear us?
Because it's general.
Thank you, Jim. I don't know if you're able to hear us. Maybe Christian, can you mute Jim until we can get an indication that he can hear us as well?
Yeah.
So in general, this, you know, because we as a culture have kind of grown up with this convenience of wall clock time, we've kind of forgotten the fact that wall clock time is a really hefty construction. It has a lot of price. We pay a lot of price in terms of the mechanism for supporting it, and it doesn't work in the general case. Right?
And there's the discovery. We have vectors of
Christian, can you
qubits
mute
that
Jim?
represent conditional probabilities or complementary.
This sounds convenient for asynchronous processor, right? Because
That's
now we are spending
yeah.
lots of time just to synchronize and wait for synchronization, right?
Well, that's exactly right. So the whole synchrony asynchrony divide is reflected when you talk about physics in terms of, you know, space-like versus time-like distance. The time-like distances you can't you can't impose you can't impose causal ordering, which is necessary to establish synchrony. So that's exactly the divide that we want to be able to reason about and support. But also notice that the interaction rule gives you an arrow to time. So in physics, there's no arrow to time. There's no, you can run quantum mechanics forwards and backwards. But if your notion of time is derived from something that does have a specific arrow, and the arrow is due to the increase of entropy, like in the case of the COM rule, because the COM rule forgets certain things. You don't know where you came from after the COM rule because there could have been lots of different processes that interact to get you to the state that you're in. And so there's a clear arrow to time as a result of this organizational orientation. So that's so again, the point is we're sort of dealing with phenomena on multiple levels. We're dealing with phenomena kind of at the foundational levels, right? So we have an account of or we have a way of thinking about space and time is
I
evolving.
guess I was on mute most of that tirade.
No, Jim, we've asked you several times if you can hear us. Are you there? Can you
I'm
hear
not
us?
hearing anything.
Yeah. Can someone text Jim and say that he's talking over us?
I don't have his number.
No. Just text him in the
Discord?
Discord or in the
One second.
Zoom. In Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
We did that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So apparently he's not responding. So anyway, so we're and by getting things so that they work at the fundamental level, and they also work at this practical level of reasoning about specific protocols like the Casper proof of stake protocol. You know, things line up in a more efficacious way. It's a little slower initially, but things because you have a lot more considerations as to what is correct. But over time, things start to move much faster because you're accounting for more and more phenomena. Long-winded answer, but hopefully.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions or comments?
Can I also ask, final plane is very simple, but I can imagine like a very complex rolling program which describes 3D some kind of geometrical object or our perception, right? If we are developing some kind of AI, and with this program and behavioral types can be then type check, you know, or process some kind of image and say, oh, you know, this object is moving in 3D as expected, and you know, this object is some kind of error in the image. Like,
yes, so that's the long-term hope. Is that through these kinds of encodings, which because of the nature of the encoding, we can apply the behavioral types and use the behavioral types to classify geometric things, including dynamically evolving geometric things. Yes, that is precisely the hope. But it's a long-term research program, right? It's out past. I mean, just getting this far is pretty amazing. So my hope is that there are future generations that want to take this up and see the potential here, and then start using these tools. But you're spot on. That's exactly the intent, is to use the typing information to classify and characterize these the geometric phenomena, topological phenomena, all of those kinds of things. And the interesting thing is that as long as the typing information is as tight as you can possibly make it, that program becomes much more feasible. And that's sort of why there was so much pressure to derive type systems that have the best possible correspondence to the system under consideration. So if you look at what the standards are, right? So you can have a correspondence between formulae and types. That's Curry-Howard. You can have realizability. You can have a cut elimination theorem, and that cut elimination theorem can coincide with the notion of computation that you start with. So you can think of those as like 4 different characteristics of increasing fidelity. And ladle generates a type system that has all 4 characteristics. So, it's got Curry-Howard, it's got realizability, it's got, a cut elimination theorem. And when you go through the process of eliminating cuts from the proofs, that process of normalizing proofs is exactly the same as your original process of computation. So it's an extremely high level of coincidence or correspondence between the type system / proof theory and the computational system that you started with. So that means that when you go and apply the type system to do classification, you know that you've got this high level of fidelity, that your classification mechanism is not going to introduce a lot of noise.
This is like a very optimized way of looking at machine learning, right?
Well, that's the hope. I mean, as I mentioned in Towards the Living World, I've always felt that the genetic algorithms have the most promise because they can give you lots of they can give you explanation. And they match what nature does, and nature does things exceptionally well. And so like the deep learning also tries to do, to mimic nature, but it doesn't mimic the part of nature where you have an explanation. With natural selection, you have a pretty clear explanation as to, how things got to be the way they are. Right. Every time you have a response to selective pressure, right, you've identified the components that go into your explanation. So if you apply the genetic algorithm ideas in the programming language domain, what you see is that with reflection, you get this connection between genome and phenome, right? So the reflective machinery is the genome, the program, so the reified program is the genome, the reflected program is the phenome, and or phenotype, and so you it feels to me like the genetic the reflective machinery is the right way to go about that. And so if you can then get your typing system to line up with the reflective machinery, and that's why the paper is titled Logic, Resource, and Reflection, then you can utilize the typing machinery to classify the genetic strategies. Right? So you can imagine these evolutionary paths, and which arise out of this genetic split between phenotype and genotype, and then you can use the type system to classify these different evolutionary strategies. And now you can start to reason at a much higher level, towards AI. Yeah. So this is, and I've pointed this out, in lots and lots of examples. So imagine that you've got, multiple different blockchains, multiple different smart contracting blockchains, but that there's a sort of interoperability protocol, right? Like, so in the case of Archchain, you've got a lot of different shards, right? And they're connected, and the interoperability is just the sharding mechanism. And so that means that in each shard you have some number of smart contracts. And then you hit a particular shard with a query, which is just a type, find me all the smart contracts that match this type. Well, maybe it doesn't have anything that exactly matches the type, but it's got some things that are pretty close matches, and then there's some delta. And so then you can go to another shard and you can say, hey, do you have either an exact match for this type? And if you don't, do you have something that matches this delta? Right? Yeah. And now you can recurse, you can reapply this algorithm all throughout the network. You can crawl the network looking for, matches to the delta and shrinking the delta at every step. And because you're shrinking the delta, you can now, when you assemble them all back together, right? When you get something that's everything plus the delta, and then you add in the delta, and that's everything plus another delta, and you add in that delta. So when you finally assemble the whole thing, it matches your type. And now you've got this, basically you've got an algorithm which will synthesize a service, synthesize a smart contract out of the existing components that are scattered across all the different shards. Right? So yeah. Nobody ever wrote that smart contract. It was assembled out of the, right? So that feels to me like a real solid application of AI. You've got the system generating smart contracts in response to a request for a smart contract. Right? Yeah. Hey Siri, find me a smart contract that does blah. Right? And Siri assembles it out of all of the shards that are there. So this is a practical application, and it uses all the pieces that I've just described.
Yeah, and this is exactly, you're giving us different encodings of different phenomena that we can that we observe, right? Like topological or geometrical, or and we can combine all of this and just query and see what is matching, and right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I was just like in the example that I was just giving, I was just focused on simple smart contracts, that do the kinds of things that you expect internet services to do. But because we have all these other encodings, those smart contracts can be representative of topological information or geometric information, a host of other kinds of things. So yeah, so it extends and that's by design, right? So I wanted to be able to support different communities, right? So in particular, I'd like to be able to support the biological community, and I, because they'd like to be able to say, hey Siri, find me a network, some signaling response network that can never get into the following state, right? And that's the design of a system that is robust against a particular disease.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, unless there's any further questions, I suggest we yield back the time. I'm really sorry we weren't able to get Jim's comments come in a coherent form. I hope he understands that he was just talking over everyone and couldn't quite connect his comments.
Sorry about that.
No worries. I think it was just, like your audio wasn't working or something. I really wanted to hear your comments. I just, we were sort of interrupting the flow, and we couldn't connect exactly what you were saying with where we were in the flow.
I was why everyone was so quiet. I mean, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, we weren't.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Happy Gurdjieff birthday. day, and we'll talk to you more in the week. And I'll see some of you on.
Yeah, sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
Can you just in the future, Casper Standups, can you just connect say something about David Deutsch representation of computation and how this relates to he's talking about
Quantum computation,
quantum universal machine and this kind of stuff. So
yeah, sure. Actually, I much prefer Bob Kuka's presentation. So if you look at Kuka and Kissinger's picturing quantum processes, that's a much better way of reasoning about quantum mechanics. And if you are interested in the questions of when you have a universal, when your quantum computation building blocks give rise to a universal machine, you might want to take a look at Kuka's ZX calculus and the question there, because it's a very active area of research as to what building blocks are both computationally complete and have other nice properties. So that's a really interesting area of research, and I suggest starting with the ZX calculus.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, of course. All right, guys. See some of you on stand up in a few minutes.
Great. Thanks, Greg.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.